مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في كل ربيع من كل تتصدر الجامعات النووية، وذلك عندما يرغب السياسيون في استعراض محاولاتهم الفكرية بزيارة مؤسسات التعليم العالي وإلقاء كلماتهم الحكيمة في احتفالات التخريج السنوية أمام الشباب المستعدين للانتقال من صفوف الدراسة إلى الحياة العملية. لكن هذه السنة تبدو مختلفة، من نيويورك إلى شيكاغو إلى لوس أنجلوس. تحولت الجامعات إلى ساحات صراع ميدانية للطلاب المحتجين على الحرب في غزة، والتي تجاوزت في بعض الحالات الحاجز بين حرية التعبير القانونية وخطاب الكراهية المعادي للسامية. وفي هذه الأجواء يرى بعض السياسيين خطرا، ويرى البعض الآخر في ذلك فرصة لبحث الأمور المتعلقة بالسياسة في الجامعات في عام 2024. يسرني أن أستضيف ثلاثة من المراقبين السياسيين المتميزين: دانيال ليبمان، راسل بيرمان، وميني راكر. Welcome back to Dackle, Washington. Universities are big business in America, but they rarely make front-page news. But not now. Universities are the battleground for cultural wars going on, triggered by the Israel-Hamas conflict, and they're especially in the news because of high-profile graduation speeches that prominent people give this time of the year. When that happens, politics cannot be far behind. So let's take a look at all this, the intersection of university conflict, of American politics. Here we are in an election year. Delighted to welcome Minnie Racker, Russell Berman, and Daniel Lippman. Thank you all for joining me. All right, when the Gaza conflict began, there were some huge rallies here in Washington and elsewhere, but campuses have now become the focus. What's been going on at some of these big American universities? Minnie, you must take a close look at this.
Yeah, so especially over the past few months, we've seen a lot more vocal pro-Palestine protests at a wide range of universities across the country, from the Ivy League to big public schools. And especially we've seen a lot of encampments. So students have been setting up huge kind of rafts of tents and just staying in place for weeks at some of these campuses across their lawns and their public spaces. And a lot of these students are demanding, that their university administrators divest from Israel, that they kind of call out what is happening in the Middle East. And this has led to a lot of tensions with administration and often even with police coming in to clear these protesters.
So, Russell, we've been having conflict at some of the leading institutions in America. I mean, we're talking Harvard, Columbia, UCLA. These are not small-time, third-rate universities, attracting quite a lot of political attention.
That's right. And the university presidents have really struggled with how to deal with this, between calling in the police and sort of allowing for, what the protesters would argue would be free speech on campus. So we've seen a lot of, especially at Columbia University in New York City, has been really a hub of this conflict, where we've seen the university president, who's relatively new, ask the police to clear out the first encampment, and then the students actually took over a building on campus, and then they had after a couple of days or a day or two, they had the police clear that out again. So the tensions have really been high. I think that the question, whether how representative these students are is a question, because these are really happening for the most part at elite Ivy League or close to Ivy League universities, which is the most prestigious in the United States. Some have occurred at public colleges and universities, but the most prominent and the most sort of aggressive have happened at places, as you mentioned, like Harvard, Columbia, and elsewhere.
So, Daniel, when this happening at our elite universities, politics cannot be far behind. Let's take first look at President Biden. What has he said and done regarding this phenomenon?
So he has talked about the importance of peaceful protest. He says that he really defends these protesters' right to peacefully make their voices heard on an important issue. But he says that when it devolves into violent protests, then law enforcement is expected to deal with that, because we can't have people breaking into buildings and making anti-Semitic comments. A lot of Jewish students feel like they are not welcome on these campuses when you have people yelling from the river to the sea, which a lot of people take as a call for Israel to be wiped off the face of the map. But Biden also faces an election year, and so he is struggling to get young him. And so he has to balance his support of Israel with his support of Palestinian rights for both policy reasons, but also electoral reasons.
So, Minnie, take us a little deeper into this. Free speech, cornerstone of American life and society, but there are, of course, limits to free speech, speech that incites violence, a gray zone of hate speech. And what way are these protests sort of stretching the boundaries of free speech and forcing people to think about the concept of free speech?
Yeah, this is the crux of the question, I think. Daniel mentioned the "from the river to the sea" slogan. A lot of the protesters would say they don't see that as a call for violence, but there's other people who, interpret that as an anti-Semitic statement because it, kind of suggests an anti-Israel view. So I think there's some real tough questions here where people are kind of struggling to define the bounds of anti-Semitism, and people disagree on that. Jewish people disagree on that. And a lot of people are kind of unwilling to say exactly where their line is, and where the line is between, anti-Semitic speech that makes these campuses unwelcoming for Jewish students and political speech that is maybe anti-Israeli policy or even anti-Israel. And I think few politicians are willing to say what kind of anti-Israel speech is acceptable to them and what kind is not, because it's a very divisive issue. And I think Democrats especially can stand to lose young anti-Zionist voters, while many Democrats in office are Zionists themselves. So it's a very politically dicey issue for these politicians to touch. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, I think Republicans have been very vocal about calling out these protesters, calling out anti-Semitism. I think they see this as an issue where they can be the party of, order. But that's kind of in contrast to some of their comments on free speech when it comes to other previous issues on campus. So there seems to be sort of a policies and approaches to free speech that kind of depends on what the speech is, which is not what we're going for here in America.
All right. So, Russell, take us a little bit further in this. The Republicans on Capitol Hill have seized on the campus protests to score all sorts of points. What have they done? And what's the political interest here?
Well, the Speaker of the House and other top Republicans actually went up to New York, to Columbia in the midst of the protests there to stand with Jewish students who are, concerned, as Minnie indicated and Daniel as well, about some of the anti-Semitic, comments, statements, and just sort of a feeling among Jewish students that they are, unsafe and really targeted in some ways by some of the protesters. And so the Speaker of the House went up there. They've also scheduled, numerous votes on resolutions, condemning anti-Semitism, condemning specific slogans like "from the river to the sea." Some of these have gone further than others. In most cases, they're symbolic. In most cases, they have gotten the support of many Democrats, either because they agree with them or because they feel like politically they can't oppose these resolutions. the Democrats and the Biden administration are starting to push back a little bit because they are concerned that these are infringing on free speech, and also as we know, the Biden administration, President Biden, has had this rift with the Israeli government that has ratcheted up, and so they are not necessarily quite as interested in being in lockstep with the Israeli government as they were a few months ago.
Daniel, we've seen some very high-profile congressional hearings, and it's tough to say that that all these brilliant university presidents have acquitted themselves with the same level of brilliance that they have on campus once they make it inside the Capitol building. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, it seems like they lose a few brain cells in terms of how to respond to basic questions. And so the president of Harvard, as well as the president of UPenn, they had to resign a few months ago because they were asked a simple question by Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, a prominent Republican on Capitol Hill. Do calls for genocide go against your university policies? And they waffled, and they did not answer with a clear statement against that genocidal remark. And so they left. They were resigned in disgrace a few months later. The head of Columbia also testified a few weeks ago on Capitol Hill, and she did okay, and she has kept her job in a very tough environment for university presidents because these students are their customers, but they also have pressure from big donors who are saying it's unacceptable that these universities have become such a focal point, and that the focus should be on learning instead of protesting a country thousands of miles away.
So, Minnie, when you look at the totality here, what's the net political impact of all this? Hurt Joe Biden, his support for free speech, hurt the Republicans. Who's gaining, who's losing by what's going on?
I would say Republicans stand to benefit here, and they seem to be looking to capitalize on this. I actually talked to a Republican donor a few weeks ago, and we were talking about Mike Johnson, and this donor was just raving to me. Yes, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. And the donor was telling me, at first he was a little apprehensive about Mike Johnson. There was a lot of chaos in the House. And then recently he's seen Johnson, go to Columbia, stand out strong in favor of Israel. And he was saying he loves seeing that, and he thinks Johnson is going to start to see a lot more support from big donors because he's been taking such a strong stance on this policy issue. We see, the Republicans holding hearings. I live not far from George Washington University, where there was an encampment, and we saw a bunch of Republican members of Congress come out here and speak out against that encampment. I think there's a sense, a lot like in 2020, where, Republicans are seeing this chaos and they're positioning themselves as the people in opposition to the chaos, that people are going to bring normalcy. I think the Democrats are in a much tougher position. I don't think this is going to be the main issue that voters vote on. I think there are a lot of people out there who are not following that closely, who are in these protests. But Democrats are in a hard position where they can only come down so hard on these protests. And I think that that makes it difficult for them to win over their full coalition of voters of November.
All right, we'll come back after the break. Russell, I'm going to ask you about the cancellation of speeches, now 2 of them, by our UN ambassador, and where this is going to end after the break in just a moment. Again, my guests today include Daniel Lippman. Daniel covers Washington politics for Politico, and he authors the social data section of Politico's New York Playbook. Daniel previously reported for the Wall Street Journal in New York. And with us is Minnie Racker. Minnie is a politics reporter at The Daily Beast. She was previously a staff writer at I Magazine, where she covered the 2024 presidential primaries. Before that, she covered politics for the National Journal and the Los Angeles Times. And with us today is Russell Berman. Russell's a staff writer at The Atlantic, covering American politics. Formerly, he was a writer-producer for the venerable McLaughlin Group on American television. All right, Russell, some protests have forced the cancellation of graduation speeches by prominent speakers, including 2 cancellations by UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Why is poor Ambassador Thomas Greenfield getting targeted by protesters, and what does this tell us about where these protests may be heading?
Well, I mean, the protests are as much against the Biden administration's support of the Israeli government and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel's war against Hamas, bombing campaign against Gaza, as it is against Israel itself. And so, Linda Thomas-Greenfield represents the administration at the UN. And so, these protesters and a lot of these students, we've seen this in years past. They did not want to hear from her. And we've seen this on campuses, more so in the last few years, where instead of, this respectful debate where you kind of hear from people that you disagree with, there's a lot more, opposition and less of a willingness to hear people with whom you disagree, right? And so I think that's part of it. I think that's not entirely, all of it here. I think mostly that it's just how volatile this issue has become on campuses. I mean, a lot of these protesters, they are not they're not really willing to compromise. They are, occupying places on these campuses with these encampments. They are, in the case of Columbia, occupying buildings. We've seen, some smaller scale protests against speakers, and Jerry Seinfeld was speaking at Duke. He's a famous comedian, had a very famous show called Seinfeld in the United States. And about 30 or a few dozen students walked out of his speech at Duke. It was actually quite a small protest, but it got an overwhelming amount of coverage that kind of overshadowed what was considered to be a pretty good speech by Jerry Seinfeld. But we're seeing a lot of that. And, President Biden is scheduled to give a couple of commencement addresses as well. And so it'll be interesting to see what level of protest, if any, he receives there.
So, Daniel, help us put all this in political context. Is there an impact that these protests and what they represent, or people's opposition to them or criticism of them, are they likely to have impacts on congressional races, on the presidential race in any particular state more than others? What's the real impact?
Well, I don't think individual congressional races are going to be impacted that much, but they do give some ammunition to Republicans and to Donald Trump, who say that President Biden has presided over a lot of chaos in his administration. We've had the war in Ukraine. We've had the war in Gaza. We've had all of this inflation, especially in terms of food costing more and houses becoming unaffordable for a lot of Americans. And so they're going to make that argument that under the last administration, it was more peaceful and less chaos. They're going to bring up the southern border as an example of that, where you have a surge in migration. It is ironic that they would be making this case a little bit because Donald Trump is the one who is currently in courtroom charged with a couple dozen felonies. And that's pretty chaotic as well. And so I feel like we have both two chaos candidates here.
Two chaos candidates. So, Minnie, in just the last several days, we've seen a lot of university presidents, not to use a term, but cave and try to bring these protests to an end by agreeing, if not completely, at least partially, to some of the demands of the protesters. Are we likely to see these protests come to an end as summer approaches? And then the really politically significant question, are we likely to see them pick up again as we get much closer to our election when students return from summer break in autumn?
Yeah, I mean, My guess would be yes. So I think we've seen protests recently. Either the police finally came in and cleared out these encampments near me at GW. That's exactly what happened. The school has set up fences and security guard late at night to make sure the protesters don't come back. So some protests are kind of forcibly ending that way. And then, as you mentioned, at some schools, most of the agreements I've seen have been about university administration basically agreeing to take a look or have a conversation about divestment and to remove some of the punishments that they handed down to some of the protesters. And I think that has to do with just, graduation's coming. Campuses want to be pristine and presentable for all the parents arriving. And the students are, many of them leaving campus. It's hard to kind of keep up that momentum that the protests have last few weeks. So I think you're right. We're going to see these protests kind of wind down as summer approaches. And then I also think you're probably right that when students come back to campus, we're going to be in the heat of election season. And so I think there's going to be a lot of passion there. And I don't know if we're going to see exactly the same kind of drama that's happened this spring, but I definitely think that's when people will be paying even more attention to these issues.
So, Russell, between now and autumn, we have the conventions, and these protesters will be on summer break. Are we going to likely see a lot of them take their summer vacations in Chicago, where the Democrats are meeting for their every 4 years convention to renominate Joe Biden?
I think it's a safe bet that many of them, numbering, I would assume in the thousands, will come to Chicago. The question is, how close they're going to get to the convention and the delegates, and how impactful they'll be. There's a lot of people who want to draw a comparison between the Chicago Convention in 1968 during the height of the Vietnam War, where you had protests and violent interactions between the police and protesters under then Mayor Daley. And it was seen as one cause of the Democrats' defeat to Richard Nixon that year. But we're living in different times, and now the conventions are designated as a national special security event. The protesters are probably going to be kept in a sort of penned off several blocks, even, half a mile from where the delegates are meeting in Chicago. So certainly the TV cameras will follow them there. But, I think, and if it gets violent, it's going to be, big news, but it may not have quite the impact that people are imagining, at least if they're thinking back 50 plus years to Chicago in 1968.
I think it is a pretty small fraction, even of young voters. A lot of young voters are more concerned about getting ahead, about the economy. My sense is that will be the issue that matters more in the long term. But I think we are going to see, as the election gets closer, if there is kind of that deep and wide sentiment that matches the amount of media coverage and attention these protests have gotten.
Does the media coverage accurately represent the scope of protest that is really happening? All right, Minnie Racker, Russell Berman, Daniel Lippman, thank you for helping explain this American phenomenon of campus protests to our viewers abroad. Thank you for joining me this week on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات وخاصة حول تأثير الاحتجاجات الجامعية في الانتخابات الرئاسية، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.